Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to our fireside corner of cozy mysteries. Pull your blanket a little closer, pour yourself something warm, and let the snow fall outside while we step into a story tonight, one wrapped in holly, candlelight, and just a little bit of danger. It is Christmas at Brambledene Manor. The halls are dressed in evergreen, the fire crackles in the drawing room, and a new governess has just arrived. Kind-eyed, soft-spoken, full of stories for the children. And one story she tells no one at all. But some secrets, no matter how carefully they are wrapped, have a way of coming undone. And when tragedy strikes beneath the mistletoe, it will take the quiet, watchful mind of a certain elderly lady from the village to see what everyone else has missed. So settle in. This is Miss Marple and the Christmas Governess Secret. The Governess Arrives. The afternoon train from London arrived at Brambledene Station a full 20 minutes late, and by the time it had wheezed to a stop, the December light had already begun to fail. A thin scatter of snow lay along the platform, undisturbed except for the tracks of a porter's trolley, and the air carried that particular stillness that comes just before a country evening closes in for good. Eleanor Hartley stepped down from the carriage with a single travelling case in one gloved hand and a smaller leather satchel clutched against her side, as though she meant never to set it down. She was perhaps 30, though there was something in her bearing, a certain careful composure, that made her seem, at first glance, older. Her coat was well made, but several winters worn, and she wore it the way a person wears something they have decided will simply have to do. Miss Hartley? A man's voice, cheerful and slightly out of breath, called from beside a waiting motor car. You'll be for the manor, I expect. I'm Baxter. I do the driving, and a good deal else besides, when Christmas comes round. Yes, thank you. She managed a small smile, the kind that did not quite reach her eyes, and allowed him to take her case. The drive to Brambledene Manor wound through hedgerows silvered with frost, past cottages with smoke curling from their chimneys, and, here and there, a wreath already hung upon a door. Eleanor watched it all pass with the quiet attentiveness of someone memorizing an escape route, though she could not have said, if asked, escape from what. The manor itself announced its presence long before the car reached the gates. A great grey house of Elizabethan bones, its windows glowing gold against the dusk, holly and ivy already twined along the stone porch. Someone, evidently, took Christmas very seriously indeed. Mrs. Ashworth will be waiting, Baxter said, pulling up beneath the portico. Mind the steps. Bit icy this time of year. The housekeeper who met her at the door was a broad, sensible woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who looked Eleanor over with the swift, practiced eye of someone who had hired and dismissed a great many young women in her time. You'll be wanting to see Mrs. Ashworth directly, she said. She likes to meet the staff proper, before the children get their hands on them. This way. The drawing room, when Eleanor was shown into it, was warm with firelight and the low murmur of conversation. A tall Christmas tree stood in one corner, only half-dressed, tinsel spilling from an open box beside it. A woman rose from the sofa near the fire, elegant, silver-haired, with the unmistakable air of someone who had run a large household for a very long time and did not intend to be surprised by it now. Miss Hartley, how good of you to come at such short notice. Mrs. Ashworth's handshake was brief and dry. I do hope the journey wasn't too dreadful. Do sit. You must be frozen through. Thank you, Mrs. Ashworth. I'm very glad to be here. Well, we are certainly glad to have you, though I confess, Miss Everleigh's departure was rather sudden, and I shan't pretend otherwise. A faint frown crossed the older woman's face, there and gone again. Family matters, she said. One doesn't like to pry. Eleanor said nothing to this, only inclined her head in a way that could have meant anything at all. It was then that the rest of the family began to gather, drawn by the sound of a new voice in the house, the way people are always drawn to newness at Christmas. First came the children. A boy of perhaps 9, sharp-eyed and solemn, and a girl a year or two younger, who arrived at a run and stopped only just short of colliding with the visitor. "Are you the new governess?" the girl demanded. "Miss Everleigh cried when she left. Did you know that?" "Cordelia," said a man's voice from the doorway, half amused, half weary. "Do let the poor woman take off her coat first." The speaker was perhaps 35, fair-haired, with the easy good looks of a man who had never had to work very hard for anything, and eyes that moved over Eleanor with a frank, assessing interest that made her glance quickly away. "Richard Ashworth," he said, extending a hand. "Eldest son, and general disappointment to the family, or so my mother tells me. Welcome to the madhouse." "Richard," Mrs. Ashworth's voice carried the particular note of a mother long accustomed to smoothing over her son's remarks. "You'll frighten the girl before she's unpacked." "I don't frighten easily," Eleanor said, and was faintly surprised to find it was nearly true. There were others still. A second son, Julian, younger and quieter, who murmured a greeting and retreated almost at once to a chair by the window with a book he did not appear to be reading, and a woman introduced simply as "my daughter-in-law Sylvia," who gave Eleanor a smile so bright and so brief that it might have been switched on and off with a small silver key. It was Sylvia's gaze that lingered a moment too long on the satchel Eleanor still carried, though nothing was said. "You must be exhausted," Mrs. Ashworth said at last, rising. "Mrs. Pruitt will show you to your room. We keep country hours here. Dinner at 7:30, though the children eat earlier, of course, and you'll take your meals with them mostly, I should think, until you find your feet." "Of course, thank you." As Eleanor turned to follow the housekeeper from the room, she felt, rather than saw, a look pass between Richard and Sylvia, quick, unreadable, the kind of look that belongs to people who have known each other's minds for a very long time. Her room was small but comfortable, tucked beneath the eaves on the 3rd floor, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the darkening garden toward a stand of bare elms. Eleanor set down her case, and only then, alone at last with the door shut, did she allow the smile to fall from her face entirely. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, the satchel still in her lap, her thumb moving absently over its worn clasp. Somewhere below, she could hear the children's voices, a burst of laughter, the clatter of the tinsel box being investigated further, a house full of warmth and noise and Christmas cheer. It was, she thought, exactly the sort of house where a person might disappear into a role and be safe for a while. That was, after all, precisely why she had come. She rose, unpacked with quick, economical movements, and hung her one good dress for dinner. The satchel she did not unpack. It went instead beneath a loose floorboard she had noticed the moment she'd stepped into the room, an old habit, checking a room for such things, though she could not have explained to anyone why it had become a habit at all. At dinner that evening, seated between Cordelia and the solemn young Julian, Eleanor told her first story of the house. A small thing, about a fox who outwitted a hunter through cleverness rather than speed, and watched the children's faces open with delight, and felt, for the first time in a long while, something almost like peace. She did not notice, or perhaps did not let herself notice, that Sylvia Ashworth watched her throughout the telling with an expression that was not delight at all, but something closer to recognition, as though she had seen that particular smile, or something very like it, somewhere before. Outside, the snow had begun to fall in earnest, soft and steady, settling over Brambledene Manor and the quiet, waiting village beyond, where an elderly lady named Mrs. Florence sat by her own fire with her knitting forgotten in her lap, watching the same snow fall past her window, and thinking, for no reason she could quite name, of secrets, and how very well they could hide, for a time, beneath something so pretty as snow. What the house whispers. By the 3rd day, Eleanor Hartley had begun to understand the shape of the household the way one learns the layout of a dark room, not all at once, but through small collisions and careful, repeated steps. Brambledene Manor, she came to see, was not so much a family as a collection of old wounds arranged around a Christmas tree. Richard Ashworth, the eldest son, ran the estate in name, though it seemed to Eleanor that very little running was actually done. He was charming in the way of men who had been told all their lives that charm would carry them, and he had a habit of appearing in doorways just as Eleanor happened to be alone in a room, with some small pretext, a book left behind, a question about the children's lessons, that never quite justified the visit. "You mustn't mind Richard," said Sylvia, on the second such occasion, appearing in the nursery doorway with the same bright, briefly lit smile she had worn at their first meeting. "He does that with everyone, new governesses especially." A pause, delicate as a blade. "Miss Everleigh found it rather trying, I believe." "I'm sure I can manage," Eleanor said mildly, and returned to the children's arithmetic. Sylvia did not leave at once. She lingered by the window, looking out over the frosted garden, and said, in a voice that seemed carefully casual, "You have a very particular way of holding yourself, Miss Hartley. Ballet, was it, or something of that kind?" "I'm afraid not," Eleanor said, and kept her eyes on Cordelia's sums. "I was simply taught to sit up straight." Sylvia's gaze did not move from the garden. "One of my sisters trained at a school in Lausanne. There's a way they teach you to walk there, heel to toe, chin level, as though you're balancing something invisible on your head. You have exactly that walk, Miss Hartley. I noticed it the first evening. There was a silence that went on a beat too long." "How observant of you," Eleanor said at last, and turned a page, and did not look up again until Sylvia had gone. Julian, the younger son, was a different matter entirely. He was perhaps 28, quiet, almost to the point of invisibility, in a household that otherwise shouted for attention, and Eleanor found she rather liked him for it. He spent most of his days in the old library at the east end of the house, cataloguing, he said, their late father's collection of natural history books, though Eleanor suspected this was as much an excuse to be left alone as it was genuine occupation. It was Julian who first asked her, gently and without any apparent design, where she had come from. "London, most recently," Eleanor said. "Before that, various places. I moved about a good deal, growing up. Army family? Something like that." He did not press, which she was grateful for, though she noticed, because she had trained herself, long ago, to notice such things, that he glanced at her a moment longer than the answer warranted, as though filing it away. "You're good with the children," he said instead. "Cordelia's taken to you already, and she takes to no one. Not since our father died, at any rate." "When was that?" 2 years this January. Heart, they said. Something flickered across his face, there and gone, like a cloud crossing the sun. Though my mother has never quite believed that, I don't think. She won't say so, but she's had the locks changed on his study twice since, and nobody's ever explained why. Eleanor absorbed this in silence, filing it away in turn. It was the children, though, who gave Eleanor her true footing in the house, and it was through them that the rest of the household, servants and family alike, began, almost despite themselves, to warm to her. She was, it turned out, a natural storyteller. In the evenings, before the nursery fire, she would gather Cordelia and young Thomas about her, and Cordelia's dolls besides, propped up in a solemn audience of 3, and she would tell them stories that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. A girl who outran a river, a boy who traded his shadow for a wish and spent a long winter earning it back, a fox, always a fox, clever and quick and never quite caught. "Where do you learn them?" Cordelia asked one evening, breathless with the ending of a tale in which a housemaid outwitted a wicked count through nothing but patience and a well-kept secret. "Did someone tell them to you when you were small?" Eleanor's hands stilled for a moment on the coverlet she was tucking around the child. "Someone did, yes," she said. "A long time ago." "Who?" "Someone I loved very much." She smoothed the coverlet flat, her voice perfectly even. "Now, bed. It's very late, and Father Christmas doesn't like to find children still awake, you know." "It was Mrs. Pruitt. listening from the corridor with an armful of fresh linens, who remarked to the cook the next morning that the new governess had a sadness in her, mark my words, the kind that doesn't come from nowhere, and the cook, who had seen a good many governesses come and go through that kitchen, only sniffed and said that sadness never hurt a soul's cooking, so it needn't hurt her teaching either. The tension in the house, when it showed itself at all, showed itself mostly at meals, and mostly between Richard and his mother. "You've spoken to Grimshaw about the Westfield lease?" Mrs. Ashworth asked one evening, over a joint of beef that Cordelia was studiously avoiding. "I've spoken to him," Richard said, in the tone of a man closing a subject rather than opening one. And it's in hand, mother. Must we do this at the table?" "We must do it somewhere, Richard, since you seem disinclined to do it in your study, where such matters generally belong." Mrs. Ashworth's voice was pleasant, almost gentle, which somehow made the words land harder than shouting would have. "Your father managed the estate's affairs at his desk, not at his dinner, and certainly not at his club." Richard's jaw tightened, and for a moment something considerably less charming than his usual manner showed through, quick as a knife edge catching the light. "My father," he said, "is dead, mother. I do hope you've noticed." The silence that followed was long enough that Eleanor, seated with the children at the far end of the table, found herself quietly refilling Thomas's water glass simply to have something to do with her hands. It was Sylvia, in the end, who broke it, laying her hand lightly over her husband's on the table, a gesture that looked, to Eleanor's practiced eye, less like comfort than like restraint. "The pudding will be along shortly," Sylvia said brightly, to no one in particular. "Cook's made her special one this year, with the sixpences in. Cordelia, darling, do sit up." The meal resumed as though nothing at all had happened, in the particular way of families who have long since perfected the art of resuming. It was later that same night, long after the children were asleep and the house had settled into its creaking, candle-lit quiet, that Eleanor rose from her narrow bed, lit a single candle, and knelt beside the loose floorboard to check, as she did, without fail, every night, that the satchel beneath it remained exactly as she had left it. It did, undisturbed, buckle facing the window, precisely as she had positioned it. And yet, kneeling there in the candlelight, she found herself troubled by something she could not quite name, a prickling sense, unfamiliar and unwelcome, of being watched. She had felt it, she realized, since dinner. Since Sylvia's hand had rested on her husband's and her eyes had drifted, just once, down the table to where Eleanor sat among the children. Eleanor blew out the candle and lay awake a long while in the dark, listening to the wind work at the old windows, and thinking that she had perhaps been wrong to believe that a house so full of warmth and Christmas greenery could not also be a house that watched. Down in the village, half a mile off, Mrs. Florence, who had lived at Brambledene long enough to have buried 2 husbands' worth of neighbours and outlasted every scandal the parish had ever produced, sat late over her correspondence, and paused, pen in hand, over a letter from an old friend in London that mentioned, almost as an afterthought, a young governess who had left her previous post in something very like disgrace and vanished from the city entirely without a forwarding address. A visitor for Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve arrived at Brambledene Manor in a flurry of greenery and last-minute panic, the sort that descends upon every large house once a year and is somehow always a surprise to everyone involved. Garlands of holly and ivy were dragged in from the cold by red-nosed gardeners and wound along the banisters under Mrs. Pruitt's exacting supervision. The tree in the drawing-room was finally, triumphantly finished, crowned with a tin star that had, according to Cordelia, belonged to her grandfather's mother, and was therefore not to be touched by anyone under the age of 40. In the kitchen, the air was thick with the smell of cloves and burnt sugar, and cook had twice been reduced to threatening violence against anyone who so much as breathed near her mincemeat. Eleanor, pressed into service arranging candles along the mantel, found herself almost able to forget, For whole stretches of the morning, the small, cold weight of watchfulness that had settled over her since the night before. It was Mrs. Ashworth who mentioned, over the general chaos of decoration, that they were to have a guest that afternoon. "Mrs. Florence is coming for tea," she announced, to no one in particular and everyone at once. "She always does, Christmas Eve. Has done since before I married into this family, if you can credit it. Sharp as a needle, that woman. Even now. Do mind your manners with her, Cordelia. She has a way of seeing straight through nonsense." "Is she very old?" Cordelia asked, with the frank interest children reserve for the elderly and the enormous. "Old enough to remember your great-grandfather scandalizing the parish," Mrs. Ashworth said, with the ghost of a smile. "But you'll like her. Everyone does, eventually, though she has a habit of making people rather uncomfortable first." Eleanor, arranging holly in a vase by the window, filed this away with the same quiet attention she gave everything in this house, a habit she could not have broken now, even if she had wished to. Mrs. Florence arrived at 3:30, delivered by Baxter, in the same motor car that had collected Eleanor from the station 4 days before, and stepped down into the frosty drive, wrapped in a wool coat the colour of a good claret, with a scarf that had clearly been knitted by hand and with more enthusiasm than skill. She was, Eleanor thought, watching from the drawing-room window, exactly what one pictured when one pictured an elderly village lady of a certain sort. Soft white hair, a gentle, unhurried way of moving, pink cheeks from the cold. And yet, there was something in the quickness of her eyes, sweeping once over the house's facade, the drive, the windows, before she ever reached the door, that suggested rather more was going on behind that pleasant face than the pleasant face let on. "Mrs. Florence, how lovely," Mrs. Ashworth said, coming forward to greet her in the front hall. "You found the road all right?" "I did worry, with the ice. Baxter drives far too carefully for there to be any real danger," Mrs. Florence said, allowing her coat to be taken. "Though I did notice the Henderson's gate is off its hinge again. Someone ought to tell them before the sheep get out and cause the whole village a great deal of bother." She smiled, mild and pleasant, and turned her attention to the hall around her, taking it in with the same unhurried thoroughness she had given the house's exterior. "What a beautiful tree, and so tall this year. Did Richard cut it himself?" "He did, actually. However did you—" "Oh, one can simply tell," Mrs. Florence said comfortably. "There's a particular unevenness to a tree cut by an impatient man in a hurry to get back indoors to his breakfast. Very charming, all the same." Mrs. Ashworth laughed, though Eleanor, standing a little apart with the children, noticed Richard's own smile falter for just a fraction of a second before it recovered itself. Tea was taken in the drawing-room, a comfortable, sprawling affair with the fire built up high and the curtains not yet drawn against the early winter dark. Eleanor sat with the children, a little removed from the main conversation, as was proper, and might have escaped Mrs. Florence's notice entirely, had it not been for Cordelia. "This is Miss Hartley," the child announced, tugging the old lady's sleeve with the confident proprietorship of a 9-year-old presenting her favourite possession. "She's our new governess. She tells the best stories, better than Miss Everly even, and Miss Everly cried when she left." "Did she indeed?" Mrs. Florence said, and turned her attention. Mild, unhurried, entirely without malice, and yet somehow thorough in a way that made Eleanor's chest tighten, upon the governess. "How do you do, Miss Hartley?" "How do you do, Mrs. Florence?" Eleanor rose, as was proper, and inclined her head. "Please, do sit. I so dislike making people stand about on my account." Mrs. Florence settled herself more comfortably into her chair, teacup balanced with the ease of long practice. "You have a very good instinct with children, I should think, if this one has taken to you so completely. Cordelia is not, if you'll forgive my saying so in front of her, a girl who warms easily." "That's not true," Cordelia said, wounded. "It is entirely true, my dear, and nothing to be ashamed of. The best people rarely warm easily." Mrs. Florence's eyes, pale blue and mild as a summer sky, moved back to Eleanor. "Tell me, Miss Hartley, where were you in service before this? Mrs. Ashworth mentioned London, I believe." "Yes, A family called Whitmore, in Kensington. Whitmore. Mrs. Florence repeated the name thoughtfully, as though tasting it. I don't believe I know them. And before that? Various places. Eleanor kept her voice light, pleasant, the voice of someone with nothing at all to hide. I moved about a good deal in my earlier years. How interesting. So few people move about these days. Everyone seems to want to put down roots the moment they're able. I've always thought there was something rather brave about the alternative. Mrs. Florence took a sip of her tea, and when she spoke again, her tone had not changed in the slightest, remained just as mild, just as pleasant, which was, Eleanor thought afterward, precisely what made the question land as it did. You have a very slight scar, just here. A small gesture, no more than a flick of one finger toward her own wrist. The sort that comes, I always think, from a burn rather badly tended at the time. One sees a good many of them, in my experience. Usually a kitchen or a laundry. Eleanor's hand moved, entirely without her permission, toward her own wrist, before she caught the gesture and stilled it. A childhood accident, she said, nothing of interest. No, I don't suppose it is, Mrs. Florence agreed pleasantly, and turned to accept a slice of cook's Christmas cake from Mrs. Ashworth, and the conversation moved on to the matter of the church service that evening, and whether the roads would hold clear enough for everyone to attend. But Eleanor, resuming her seat beside the children, found that her hands were not quite steady, and that the small, cold weight of being watched, which had troubled her since the night before, had settled now into something considerably more precise. The particular, unsettling sensation of having been seen, thoroughly and without effort, by someone who had not needed to raise her voice, or press, or even seem particularly interested, in order to do it. It was much later, after Mrs. Florence had been driven safely home through the frost-hard lanes and the family had gone in to dress for the evening service, that Sylvia found the old lady's scarf left behind on the drawing-room sofa and remarked, apparently idly, to her husband as she folded it. She's taken quite an interest in the new governess. Florence takes an interest in everyone, Richard said, not looking up from his newspaper. It's rather her whole occupation since Colonel Florence died. Nothing better to do with herself than notice things about the neighbours. Sylvia smoothed the scarf flat, folding it with rather more care than the object strictly required. All the same, I noticed things about her myself, the very first evening. I'm rather curious to know whether Mrs. Florence noticed the same things I did. Richard turned a page, and did not ask what things his wife meant, which was, in its own way, its own small answer. Outside, the snow had begun again, soft and steady against the darkened windows, and somewhere down in the village, in a small warm sitting room with a fire banked low for the night, Mrs. Florence sat with her knitting, forgotten once more in her lap, thinking not of Christmas at all, but of a young woman's hand moving instinctively to cover a scar at her wrist, and of the particular, unmistakable quality of a lie told very well by someone who has had, she suspected, a great deal of practice. Silent night. The church at Brambledene was small and cold and packed to its ancient rafters, candlelight flickering gold against stone walls that had stood through 4 centuries of Christmas Eves, very like this one. Eleanor sat at the end of the family pew, with Cordelia drowsing against her arm, and Thomas fidgeting with the hymn book, and let the familiar carols wash over her, once in royal David's city, sung first by a single boy's voice, high and clear, before the whole congregation gathered it up and carried it forward. She had always loved this carol. It was, she thought, one of the few things that had survived intact from a childhood she otherwise tried very hard not to remember, and for a moment, eyes closed, voice joining quietly with the rest, she allowed herself simply to feel it, the old, uncomplicated ache of it, rather than guard against it, as she guarded against nearly everything else. When she opened her eyes, she found Julian watching her from further along the pew, his own hymn book unopened in his hands, an expression on his quiet face that she could not quite read. He looked away at once when he saw her notice, and made a show of finding his place in the hymn book, though the carol was nearly finished. She thought nothing more of it. There was, after all, a great deal in this house that people did not quite look at directly, herself included. They returned to the manor a little after 11, stamping snow from their boots in the great hall, cheeks bright with cold, and Mrs. Ashworth declared that there was mulled wine waiting in the drawing-room for the grown-ups, and hot milk for the children, and that everyone was to warm themselves before anyone dared think of bed. It was in the general, comfortable disorder of coats being shed and boots pulled off that Eleanor first noticed something was not quite right. Mrs. Ashworth, usually so composed, so entirely mistress of her own household, stood very still in the doorway of the study, a room Eleanor had understood, from Julian's earlier remark, to have been kept locked since her husband's death, and her face, in the light of the hall lamp, had gone the colour of old paper. "Mother?" Richard, unwinding his scarf, glanced over. "What is it?" "Nothing." Mrs. Ashworth pulled the study door shut, with rather more force than was necessary, and turned the key that hung, Eleanor now realized, on a chain at her own waist, not left in any lock at all. Nothing at all. "Go on up, children, Miss Hartley, if you would." But her hand, Eleanor noticed, trembled very slightly as she withdrew the key, and her eyes went once, briefly, to Richard, and then to Julian, and then away again, as though she had thought better of whatever she had meant to say. "Is someone getting into Father's study?" Cordelia asked, with the flat, unnerving directness of a child who has understood far more of the evening's undercurrents than anyone realizes. Aunt Sylvia said it was haunted. "Sylvia says a great many things," Mrs. Ashworth said, recovering herself with visible effort, and managed something like her usual smile. "Bed now. Father Christmas won't come to a house full of children still awake, you know." It was gone midnight, when Eleanor, having settled the children and banked the nursery fire, found she could not sleep. The house had that particular restless quality that follows a large gathering, not quite silent, full of small creaks and settlings, distant voices carrying faintly up the stairwell from where the adults still sat over their wine. She went down, meaning only to fetch a glass of water from the kitchen, and it was on the first-floor landing, in the dim light of a single lamp left burning, that she came upon Richard, standing quite alone outside the locked study door, one hand flat against the wood, as though he might, through sheer will, feel something of what lay beyond it. "Mr. Ashworth." Eleanor stopped, uncertain whether to withdraw. He turned, and for a moment, brief, unguarded, gone almost before she registered it, his face showed something she had not seen in him before. Not the easy charm, not the faint, restless irritation he showed his mother across the dinner table, but something closer to grief, raw and entirely unrehearsed. "Miss Hartley." He recovered himself quickly, though not quite quickly enough. "You should be asleep. It's very late." "I couldn't settle. I was only going down for water." She hesitated, and then, because something in his face made her unable simply to walk past, she added, gently, "Is everything quite all right?" "Perfectly," he said, in a voice that suggested the opposite. Then, unexpectedly, almost as though the wine had loosened something in him he had not meant to loosen. "My father died in that room, Miss Hartley. 2 years ago this January." They said his heart simply stopped. "He was 53 and healthy as a horse his whole life, and it simply stopped, and nobody has ever quite explained to my satisfaction how that happens to a man who walked 4 miles a day and never touched a cigarette in his life." "I'm very sorry," Eleanor said quietly, because there was nothing else to say to that. "My mother had the locks changed the week after the funeral, and again, 6 months ago, for reasons she has never troubled to explain to any of us." He gave a short laugh, without any humor in it at all. One begins to wonder, in a house like this, what precisely one's own mother imagines she is keeping out. Or keeping in. He seemed then to hear himself, to remember, all at once, who he was speaking to, and that the hour and the wine had carried him somewhere he had not intended to go. "Forgive me, that was not at all appropriate. Christmas does strange things to a household, I find." He straightened, and something of his usual easy manner slid back over his face like a mask settling into place. "Good night, Miss Hartley. Sleep well." He went, and Eleanor stood alone on the landing a moment longer, looking at the locked study door, and thought that whatever secrets this house was keeping, they had evidently begun accumulating long before her own arrival in it. She did not, in the end, get her glass of water directly, for it was on her way back from the kitchen, moving quietly through the dim ground-floor passage, that she heard voices from the small morning room, low, urgent, unmistakably Sylvia and Mrs. Ashworth, though the words themselves were indistinct through the heavy door, until she drew, without quite meaning to, close enough to catch them. "Cannot keep pretending it will simply resolve itself, Margaret. You know as well as I do what the solicitor said." "I know precisely what the solicitor said, Sylvia, and I will thank you not to raise the matter again on Christmas Eve, of all nights." "When, then?" "When Richard's finally run us all into the ground with his—" The voices dropped, suddenly, to something too low for Eleanor to catch, and she realized, with a small cold jolt, that she was standing in a darkened passage at midnight, listening at a closed door like the worst sort of housemaid, and drew back at once, cheeks burning, and made her way upstairs without her water at all. But the fragment stayed with her, turning over and over in her mind as she lay sleepless in her narrow bed, the solicitor said, and beneath the floorboard, in the dark, her own satchel lay exactly where she had left it, holding its own careful secret, and she thought, not for the first time since arriving at Brambledene Manor, that a house full of warmth and candlelight could hold within it as many hidden rooms as any she had ever known. She was not the only one, it seemed, who had come to this Christmas with something to hide. Outside, the snow fell on, soft and relentless, and somewhere in the sleeping village, Mrs. Florence, who made a small private habit of walking her old spaniel past the manor gates each night before bed, whatever the weather, paused at the edge of the drive, looking up at the one window still lit on the ground floor, long after every other light in the great house had gone dark, and thought that Christmas Eve had a way, every year without fail, of bringing a household's true face up close beneath its cheerful paint. Christmas morning. Christmas morning came in white and still and beautiful, the kind of morning that makes even a troubled house forget itself for an hour or two. Snow lay thick and unbroken across the lawn, and the children were up before the sun, their voices carrying through the corridors with a happiness that seemed, for a little while, to smooth over whatever had passed in the small hours of the night before. Eleanor came down with Cordelia and Thomas to find the drawing-room transformed, presents heaped beneath the tree, the fire built high, Mrs. Ashworth presiding over the whole scene with an expression of determined, brittle cheer that did not quite match the shadows beneath her eyes. "Happy Christmas, Miss Hartley," she said, and pressed into Eleanor's hands a small, neatly wrapped parcel that turned out to contain a good woolen scarf, clearly bought with genuine thought rather than obligation. "You've been such a comfort to the children this week. I don't know how we'd have managed the holiday without you. That's very kind of you, Mrs. Ashworth. Thank you." Eleanor found herself oddly moved, and said so with more warmth than she had intended to show since arriving at the house. Richard did not come down for the opening of presents. It was remarked upon only lightly at first, Sylvia observing, with a faint, tight smile, that her husband had never had much use for mornings, Christmas or otherwise, and the family carried on without him, opening gifts, exclaiming over Cordelia's delight at a new set of watercolors, laughing at Thomas's solemn insistence that his new pocket-knife made him now, officially, a man. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and the pile of torn paper had grown considerable, when Mrs. Pruitt appeared in the doorway with a look on her broad, sensible face that stopped every conversation in the room at once. "Mrs. Ashworth, might I have a word?" Something in the housekeeper's voice, flat, careful, entirely unlike her usual brisk manner, made Mrs. Ashworth rise at once and cross the room without a word of explanation to anyone. Eleanor, watching, saw the two women speak quietly in the doorway, saw Mrs. Ashworth's face change, go, in the space of a single sentence, from mild concern to something far worse, and saw her hand come up to grip the doorframe as though the floor beneath her had shifted. "What is it?" Sylvia was on her feet now too, Cordelia's new watercolours forgotten in her lap. "Margaret, what's happened?" "It's Richard." Mrs. Ashworth's voice was strange, hollow, not at all her own. Mrs. Pruitt found him in the study. "He's not—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. What followed had the strange, disjointed quality of a scene remembered rather than lived. Sylvia's cry, sharp and terrible, cutting through the room. Julian, moving past his mother, into the hall at a run. Eleanor, without quite deciding to, gathering the children close against her, turning their faces away, murmuring something soft and meaningless, simply to give them somewhere to put their attention, besides the chaos breaking open around them. "Miss Hartley." Mrs. Ashworth's voice, when it reached her, was thin and urgent. "Take them upstairs, please. Whatever you must tell them. Not this. Not yet." Eleanor did as she was asked, shepherding Cordelia and Thomas up the great staircase with a steadiness she did not feel, past Baxter, running for the telephone in the hall below, past a housemaid, weeping openly against the banister, and only when the nursery door was shut behind them, only when the children were settled with a story she barely heard herself telling, did she allow her own hands to shake. Richard Ashworth was dead. She had spoken with him not 12 hours before, on the landing outside his father's locked study, his face raw with a grief he had not meant to show her. And now he was gone too, in that same house, on this of all mornings. The study, when the doctor arrived from the village an hour later, told its own quiet story to those permitted to see it. Richard had been found seated in his father's old chair, behind the desk, a glass overturned upon the blotter and a nearly empty decanter of brandy beside it. There was no wound, no sign of struggle, nothing at all to suggest violence in the ordinary sense, only a man who appeared, to the untrained eye, to have simply fallen asleep in his chair sometime in the small hours of Christmas morning, and never woken again. Hart, the local doctor, a weary man named Dr. Pemberton, pronounced at first, with the easy confidence of a man who had signed a great many such certificates in his career, and saw no particular reason to doubt his own judgment now. Very like his father, poor devil. It runs in families, this sort of thing, whatever anyone says. But it was Mrs. Pruitt, steadier now, though still pale, who mentioned quietly to the young constable summoned from the village that Mr. Richard had complained of feeling unwell before retiring the previous evening, that he had asked her, in fact, to bring him a glass of warm milk to settle his stomach, and that she had left it outside the study door as he'd asked, the door being locked from within as he liked it when he worked late, and had not seen him alive again. And it was cook, questioned in her own kitchen with flour still on her hands, who mentioned, reluctantly, as though she felt disloyal even in the mentioning, that the decanter of brandy found beside Mr. Richard had been a fresh one, opened only the evening before, a Christmas gift left in the study by person or persons she could not say, for she had not put it there herself, and had in fact no idea at all how it had come to be in a room that had been locked, by Mrs. Ashworth's own order, for the better part of 2 years. It was Julian, white-faced and strangely calm in the manner of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will, who suggested, over his mother's initial, exhausted protests, that someone ought to send for Mrs. Florence. "She'll only be told the same as everyone else, eventually," he said. "The whole village will know by nightfall regardless. Better she hears it properly, from us, and—" He stopped, seeming to hear something in his own words he had not quite intended. "She has a way of seeing things clearly, Mother. You know she does. Everyone in the village says so." "Seeing what things clearly, Julian?" Mrs. Ashworth's voice had an edge to it now, sharp beneath the grief. "My son is dead. There is nothing to see. His heart failed him, exactly as his father's did, and I will not have this house turned into a spectacle, for the amusement of some old woman's curiosity." But it was Sylvia, red-eyed. Her earlier hysteria collapsed now into something quieter, and far more frightening, who spoke next, and her voice, when it came, was very steady. "Send for her," she said. "I want to know what happened to my husband, Margaret. I want to know precisely what happened, and I do not think Dr. Pemberton is the man to tell me." Mrs. Florence arrived at Brambledene Manor a little before 2 o'clock that afternoon, wrapped once more in her claret-coloured coat, her expression composed and gentle, and entirely without the eager curiosity Mrs. Ashworth had accused her of. She said very little upon her arrival beyond a few quiet words of sympathy to Mrs. Ashworth, and asked, with disarming mildness, whether she might simply sit for a while in the drawing-room and take in the shape of things, if no one minded. No one minded. No one, in the general shock and disorder of the house, seemed to have the energy left to mind anything at all. She sat by the window for a long while, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving slowly and without apparent purpose over the room. The half-cleared wreckage of Christmas morning, torn paper still scattered by the tree, a child's new watercolour set abandoned on the sofa. The fire burned low and not yet built up again, and it was only Eleanor, passing the drawing-room door with a tray of tea no one had asked for and no one, in the end, would drink, who noticed that Mrs. Florence's gaze, mild and unhurried as ever, came to rest for a long moment on the locked study door across the hall, and stayed there. "A great pity," Mrs. Florence said quietly, to no one in particular, when Eleanor paused uncertainly in the doorway. "Christmas Day, of all days. Though I find, Miss Hartley, that tragedy has a curious habit of choosing its moments rather precisely, when one troubles to look closely enough. Don't you think so?" Eleanor, standing very still with the tea tray in her hands, found she did not trust herself to answer, and was grateful when Mrs. Florence did not, in fact, seem to require one. Questions asked gently. The days that followed Christmas settled over Brambledene Manor with the strange, muffled quality of a house waiting to exhale. Dr. Pemberton's certificate, heart failure, natural causes, no further inquiry required, had satisfied the coroner's office, and would, by all ordinary reckoning, have been the end of the matter entirely, had it not been for a short, quiet conversation between Sylvia Ashworth and the local police inspector, conducted, at Mrs. Florence's gentle suggestion, before the certificate was finally signed and filed away. "I only wish it looked into properly," Sylvia had said, and something in her steady, exhausted insistence had been enough, in a village the size of Brambledene, to have Inspector Hale, a heavy-set, methodical man who had known Mrs. Florence for the better part of 20 years, and had learned, over that time, never to dismiss her interest in a matter too quickly, request a second look at the study before the family were permitted to have it cleaned and reopened for use. It was the brandy decanter that had first troubled Dr. Pemberton, on reflection, and troubled Inspector Hale considerably more once the contents were properly tested. A quantity of Foxglove, digitalis, sufficient, in a man already given, as the doctor now recalled rather too late, to occasional complaints of a weak chest, to produce symptoms that might very easily be mistaken, by a tired country doctor called out at dawn on Christmas morning, for a heart simply giving out. It was not, Inspector Hale said gravely to Mrs. Ashworth in her own morning room, entirely conclusive. But it was, he said, quite enough to warrant a closer look at who had given her son that decanter, and when, and why. Mrs. Florence, who had not been asked to involve herself officially in any capacity whatsoever, nonetheless found herself, in the days that followed, a frequent and apparently welcome visitor at Brambledene Manor, invited, ostensibly, to sit with Mrs. Ashworth in her grief, and finding, in the course of these visits, a great many opportunities to speak quietly with everyone else in the house besides. She spoke first with Mrs. Pruitt, in the kitchen, over a cup of tea the housekeeper had not quite had the heart to refuse her. "You left the milk outside the study door yourself, you said." "I did, ma'am. 11:30, or thereabouts. Mr. Richard had rung down not 20 minutes before, asking for it. Said his stomach was troubling him. And the decanter of brandy. You're quite certain you didn't bring that up yourself?" "Quite certain, ma'am. I'd have remembered." We don't keep brandy of that quality in general use. That was a good one, French, the sort Mr. Ashworth Sr. used to keep for himself and no one else, before he passed. I couldn't tell you where it came from at all, only that it wasn't there Christmas Eve morning, when I dusted the room last, and it was there by the time Mr. Richard was found. So someone brought it to him between Christmas Eve morning and the small hours of Christmas Day, Mrs. Florence said thoughtfully, and that someone had access both to a room that had been locked for 2 years and to a rather particular taste in French brandy that only the late Mr. Ashworth was known to keep. Mrs. Pruitt said nothing to this, but her silence and the careful way she avoided Mrs. Florence's eye said a good deal on its own. She spoke next with Julian, finding him, as she had rather expected to, alone in the library among his father's books. "You suggested I be sent for," she said, settling herself into the chair opposite him without waiting to be asked. I wondered why. Julian did not look up at once from the book in his lap, though Mrs. Florence noted, with the quiet attentiveness of long habit, that he was not reading it, had not, in fact, turned a page since she'd entered the room. "Because someone ought to look at this properly," he said at last. "And because I did not think my mother would permit it, left to her own devices. She has spent 2 years insisting nothing was wrong about my father's death, Mrs. Florence. I did not much fancy watching her do the same for Richard." "You believe, then, that something was wrong about your father's death?" He was silent for a long moment. "I don't know," he said finally. "I've never known. He was 53 and healthy, and then he wasn't, and my mother changed the locks and never explained herself, and I have spent 2 years telling myself that grief makes people do strange things, and never quite believing it." He closed the book at last, though he did not look at her directly. "And now, Richard, in the same room, and I find I no longer have the luxury of telling myself comfortable stories about either of them. Tell me," Mrs. Florence said gently, "about the new governess." Something in Julian's face shifted, not alarm exactly, but a kind of wary attention. "Miss Hartley, what has she to do with any of this?" "Very possibly nothing at all," Mrs. Florence said comfortably. "I ask about everyone new to a house when something like this occurs. It is only sensible. What do you make of her?" "I like her," Julian said, with a simplicity that surprised even himself, Mrs. Florence thought, watching his face. "She's kind to the children, kinder than the position strictly requires. And she's careful. About herself, I mean. She doesn't talk about where she's from, or her family, or anything of that kind. I asked her once, and she turned the question very neatly aside, the way someone does when they've had a great deal of practice at it. And when did she arrive at Brambledene, precisely? 4 days before Christmas Eve, the day before Richard." He stopped. "Yes," Mrs. Florence said quietly. "I had noted the timing myself." It was Sylvia, when Mrs. Florence found her that afternoon in the small morning room, who proved the most forthcoming of all. Though, whether from genuine grief, or genuine suspicion, or some combination of the two that even she herself could not quite untangle, Mrs. Florence could not yet say. "I want to be honest with you, Mrs. Florence, because I think you are the only person in this house at present who will actually do something with honesty, rather than simply file it away out of politeness." Sylvia's hands were folded very tightly in her lap. "I did not like Miss Hartley from the moment she arrived. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because there is something about her that does not fit. Not the way she speaks, not entirely, and not the way she carries herself. And I have wondered, more than once this week, whether Richard noticed it too." "Noticed what, precisely?" "He was drawn to her." Sylvia's voice was flat, controlled, the voice of someone reciting facts she had already turned over 100 times alone. "I saw it within a day of her arrival. The way he found reasons to be near the nursery, the way he watched her at dinner. It is not the first time. My husband was not a faithful man, Mrs. Florence, and I had long since stopped expecting him to be, but I had also long since learned to notice when a new woman entered our household and old patterns began repeating themselves. You believe Miss Hartley encouraged this attention? I believe, Sylvia said carefully, that a woman arrives in this house 4 days before Christmas, with a past she will not discuss, and within a week my husband is dead of poisoning in a room that has been locked for 2 years, and I find myself unable, Mrs. Florence, to call that simply a coincidence, however much I might wish to. Mrs. Florence said nothing for a long moment, her pale blue eyes resting mildly on the younger woman's tense, unhappy face. It is a very reasonable suspicion, she said at last. I shall certainly bear it in mind. Though I confess I have found, in a great many years of observing such matters, that the person a house is most eager to suspect is very rarely the person actually responsible. Grief has a way of wanting a face to settle upon, Mrs. Sylvia, and a new face, an unfamiliar one, is so very much easier to fix upon than a familiar one. She found Eleanor, last of all, in the nursery, tidying away the children's Christmas gifts with the quiet, careful movements of someone trying very hard to make herself useful in a house that had, in the space of a single morning, become something considerably darker than the one she had arrived in. Miss Hartley, I wonder if I might trouble you for a few minutes. Eleanor's hands stilled on the watercolor set she was returning to its box. Of course, Mrs. Florence. You spoke with Richard Ashworth, I understand, on the landing outside the study, late on Christmas Eve. Mrs. Pruitt happened to mention it. She saw you both from the stairs. There was a brief, careful silence. Yes, Eleanor said at last. I couldn't sleep. I was going down for water, and he was standing outside the door. We spoke only a few minutes. About what, if you don't mind my asking? His father, the locks. He seemed, Eleanor hesitated, choosing her words with visible care. He seemed unhappy, Mrs. Florence, troubled about something, though he didn't say precisely what. And you did not think to mention this conversation to anyone in the days since. I didn't think it mattered. Eleanor's voice remained steady, but her hands, Mrs. Florence noted, had gone very still around the watercolor box. A man expressing grief about his father is hardly unusual in a house of mourning. I didn't imagine it would be relevant to anything that happened afterward. No, Mrs. Florence said gently. I don't suppose you did. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and paused at the nursery door, looking back at the young governess, with an expression that held no accusation whatsoever, and was, for precisely that reason, considerably more unsettling than accusation would have been. You have a very old scar on your wrist, Miss Hartley, and a walk that belongs to a school in Lausanne, and a habit of turning every question about your own past very neatly aside. I wonder very much what it is you are protecting yourself from. I don't imagine, somehow, that it has anything at all to do with Richard Ashworth's death, but I find I should like to know it all the same, before I can say so with any confidence. She left before Eleanor could find an answer, and Eleanor stood alone in the nursery for a long while afterward, the watercolor box forgotten in her hands, her heart beating very fast, understanding with a cold, sinking clarity that whatever careful distance she had maintained since arriving at Brambledene, it had not, in the end, been careful enough. The satchel. It was Sylvia who found the loose floorboard, she would say afterward, and would, in fact, go on saying it for a long time after, to anyone who asked, and a good many who didn't, that she had not gone into Miss Hartley's room with any particular intention, that she had simply noticed, passing the third-floor landing on her way to fetch a spare blanket from the linen cupboard, that the governess's door stood very slightly ajar, and that Eleanor herself was safely occupied below with the children's luncheon, and that a woman recently widowed, in a house recently visited by murder, might surely be forgiven a small lapse of scruple regarding a stranger's privacy. Whatever her reasons, it was Sylvia's foot that caught, quite by accident she insisted, on the loose board beneath the narrow bed, and Sylvia's hand that drew out the worn leather satchel from beneath it, and Sylvia's voice, sharp, with something between triumph and dread, that summoned Mrs. Florence up to the third floor not 20 minutes later. I want you to see this before I say a word to anyone else, Sylvia said, setting the satchel on the narrow bed, with the careful reverence of someone handling evidence at a trial. "I want a witness, Mrs. Florence. I want it done properly." Mrs. Florence regarded the satchel for a long moment without touching it. "You've opened it already, I take it." Sylvia had the grace to colour slightly. "Yes. Then you had better show me what you found, since the damage, as it were, is already done." Mrs. Florence's voice carried no particular censure, only the mild, practical tone of a woman accustomed to finding the most efficient path through an already untidy situation. Sylvia opened the satchel and drew out its contents with visibly unsteady hands. A small bundle of letters, tied with faded ribbon, a photograph, creased from long handling, of a young woman who was unmistakably Eleanor Hartley, though younger, standing beside an older man Mrs. Florence did not recognize, both of them smiling in a way that suggested some occasion of genuine happiness now long past. And, at the very bottom, folded small and pressed flat, as though it had been read and reread a great many times, a newspaper cutting, brittle with age, its headline still perfectly legible. "Governess dismissed amid scandal. Whitmore family declines." To comment, Mrs. Florence read it through twice, unhurried, while Sylvia watched her face with poorly concealed anxiety. "There," Sylvia said, when the silence had stretched a beat too long for her patience. "You see, she lied to my mother-in-law about her previous position, or near enough. Dismissed amid scandal, and not a word of it mentioned when she came here. It says here she was dismissed following an accusation of theft," Mrs. Florence observed mildly, "which the family in question subsequently declined to pursue through any formal channel. That is a very particular kind of scandal, Mrs. Sylvia, the kind that tends to attach itself rather more readily to young women in service than to the households that employ them, whatever the truth of the matter actually was." "You don't think she did it then, whatever it was?" "I think," Mrs. Florence said, setting the cutting down with great care, exactly where she had found it, "that I should very much like to hear the answer from Miss Hartley herself, rather than continue speculating over her belongings behind her back, which is, I might add, precisely what we are both doing at this present moment, and ought to stop." Eleanor, summoned to her own room and confronted with the open satchel laid bare upon her bed, went very white, and then, unexpectedly, very still. The stillness, Mrs. Florence thought, watching her closely, not of guilt collapsing, but of a long-held tension finally, exhaustedly, giving way. "I suppose," Eleanor said at last, "there's no point now in continuing to say nothing." "None whatsoever, my dear," Mrs. Florence agreed, not unkindly. "Sit down. You look as though you need to." Eleanor sat and told it plainly, in a voice that grew steadier the longer she spoke, as though the telling itself were a weight being set down after a very long carrying. "The photograph is of my father. He died when I was 21, and left nothing but debts, and I took the first position I could find, with the Whitmore family in Kensington, because I had no other way to keep myself. Mrs. Whitmore's husband." Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. "He was not a good man, Mrs. Florence. Not to his wife, and not, in the end, to me. When I refused him, he told his wife I had attempted to steal from her jewel case. It was not true, but it was his word against a governess's, and we both know very well which of those carries more weight in a house like that." "And the letters?" "From my father, mostly. From before he died. And one," Eleanor's voice caught, just slightly, "from Mrs. Whitmore herself, written some months after I left. An apology, of sorts. She had found out the truth eventually, I believe, though far too late to undo what her husband's accusation had already cost me. I kept it because it was the only proof I had, if it ever came to needing proof again, that I was not what that newspaper cutting says I am. And you have carried it with you ever since. Checked upon it every night, I should imagine, the way a person checks upon the one thing in the world that still tells them the truth about themselves." Eleanor looked up, startled by the precision of it. "Yes," she said quietly, "exactly that. Mrs. Florence nodded slowly, and there was, for the first time since the conversation had begun, something genuinely gentle in her expression, not the mild, watchful gentleness she wore for everyone, but something closer to real sympathy. "I believed as much," she said. "A woman guarding stolen jewels does not check upon them nightly out of grief, Miss Hartley. She checks upon them out of greed, and there is a very great difference in the manner of it, to anyone troubling to look closely. You have been guarding a wound, not spoils. I am sorry it took Mrs. Sylvia's rather uncharitable curiosity to bring the matter into the open, but I confess I am glad, all the same, that it has been brought into the open at last. It clears a great deal of unnecessary underbrush from the path." "Then you don't think I had anything to do with Richard Ashworth's death?" "No, my dear, I did not think so before this conversation, and I am considerably more certain of it now." Mrs. Florence rose, smoothing her skirt with brisk, businesslike movements, entirely at odds with the softness of a moment before. "Which means, unfortunately, that whoever poisoned that brandy decanter remains very much unaccounted for, and I find I have rather less time to waste on red herrings than I had feared, and rather more urgent matters to attend to than I had hoped." It was the greenhouse in the end that gave her the thread she needed, the greenhouse, and a conversation with the head gardener that Sylvia's discovery had, in its clumsy way, at least freed Mrs. Florence to pursue without further distraction. "Foxglove," the gardener confirmed, when she asked, "grows wild along the old wall by the kitchen garden, has done for years. Mrs. Ashworth Sr. planted it herself, if my father's stories are right, back when the old master was alive. Pretty thing. Poisonous as anything, mind, if a body doesn't know to leave it be. Everyone in the house knows it's there. Been telling them for years to have it dug out, on account of the children, but nobody's ever troubled to see it done." "Everyone in the house," Mrs. Florence repeated thoughtfully. "And who, precisely, would know how to prepare it? How much would be required, and in what form, to do the sort of harm we are discussing?" The gardener considered this with the slow care of a man who did not like the direction the question was taking him. "Old Mr. Ashworth kept bees," he said finally. "Knew a fair bit about plants and their properties, same as any man who's kept bees his whole life does, one way or another. Taught the mistress a good deal of it too, over the years. Which flowers to keep from the hives, which to encourage. She could tell you foxglove from digitalis, and back again quicker than most doctors, I shouldn't wonder, though I couldn't say why she'd ever have cause to use such knowledge for anything but her garden." Mrs. Florence stood very still amid the pale green rose of the greenhouse, the cold afternoon light slanting through the glass, and felt the last stubborn piece of the pattern settle quietly into place, not with triumph, but with the particular, familiar sadness of a woman who has, once again, found the truth precisely where she least wished to find it. Not in a stranger's hidden satchel, but in the house's own mistress, who had planted that particular flower with her own hands, beside her own husband, in what had once, presumably, been a garden built entirely out of love. "What Christmas unwraps?" Mrs. Florence asked that the family gather in the drawing-room at 7 o'clock that evening, and there was something in the quiet, unhurried manner of the request, carried by Mrs. Pruitt from door to door, with no further explanation offered, that ensured every member of the household arrived precisely on time, and none of them said very much to one another while they waited. The fire had been built up high against the cold, and the Christmas tree still stood in its corner, tinsel catching the firelight, entirely unaware, as trees are, of the uses to which its season had been put. Mrs. Ashworth sat very upright in her usual chair, hands folded in her lap, her face composed into the same careful stillness she had worn since Christmas morning. Sylvia sat apart from her, close to Julian, who had not, Mrs. Florence noted, left his sister-in-law's side since the events of that afternoon. Eleanor stood near the window with the children safely dispatched to the nursery under Mrs. Pruitt's supervision, her own composure hard-won and visibly fragile. Inspector Hale had come too, at Mrs. Florence's quiet request, and stood near the door with the patient, watchful stillness of a man who had learned Over 20 years of knowing her, exactly when to let her speak, and exactly when to step forward himself. "I know this has been a very great deal to bear," Mrs. Florence began, settling herself into the chair by the fire as though she had been invited to nothing more than an ordinary evening's conversation. "And I do not intend to prolong it any further than necessary. But I think it right that you should all hear this together, rather than have it come to you separately, in pieces, the way these things so often do." "You know who did this?" Mrs. Ashworth said. It was not a question. "I believe I do, yes." Mrs. Florence's pale eyes moved gently over the room, resting on no one in particular. "I should like, if I may, to begin with your husband, Margaret, rather than with Richard. I think it is where this story truly begins." Something flickered across Mrs. Ashworth's face. The first crack, Eleanor thought, watching from the window, in a composure that had held remarkably steady until that moment. "My husband died of a weak heart," Mrs. Ashworth said. "As did my son." "Your husband," Mrs. Florence said, gently but without hesitation, "died of digitalis poisoning, delivered, I believe, in a glass of the warm milk he always took before retiring. A habit, I am told, of many years' standing, and one that would have made the bitterness of the foxglove very easy indeed to disguise. You knew the plant intimately, Margaret. You planted it yourself, beside your husband, in the early years of your marriage, and you learned its properties from him, as he learned the keeping of bees. It would have required no great cunning at all, only knowledge you already possessed, and an opportunity that presented itself, night after night, in the ordinary course of your marriage." The room had gone entirely silent. Even the fire seemed for a moment to hold its breath. "Why," Julian said at last, very quietly, "would my mother do such a thing to my father?" It was Mrs. Ashworth herself who answered, and when she spoke, her voice had changed entirely. The brittle composure gone, replaced by something flat and exhausted. The voice of a woman who has carried a weight so long that setting it down, however terrible the setting down might be, comes almost as a relief. "Because your father was going to ruin us, Julian. All of us. He had been gambling for years. I didn't know the full extent of it until the end. None of us did. He was very careful to keep it from the household. And in the final months, he had begun mortgaging the estate itself, piece by piece. To men, I would not have your father in his health, let alone your father as I remembered him, ever have wished you to meet. There would have been nothing left. Nothing for you, nothing for Richard, nothing for this house that my own grandmother's grandmother was born in." Her hands, folded so carefully in her lap, had begun, very slightly, to tremble. "I asked him to stop. I begged him. He told me it was none of my concern, that a wife's place was not to question her husband's business, and he laughed when I raised it a second time, and told me I understood nothing of finance and never would. I did not plan it, not truly, not at first. But the foxglove was there, and I knew what it could do, and one night I simply did it. And I have told myself every day since that I did it for this family, for all of you, and Richard." Sylvia's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "What had Richard done, that you—" "Richard found the solicitor's letters." Mrs. Ashworth closed her eyes briefly. "The ones concerning his father's debts. Debts I had spent 2 years quietly, secretly clearing, through means I would rather not have detailed to any of you. Means that required every penny this estate could spare, and a good deal more discretion than I had realized I possessed. He confronted me about it 3 days before Christmas, the very day before Miss Hartley arrived. He had found figures that did not add up, transactions he could not account for, and he told me, quite gently, I will say that for him, he was not a cruel man, whatever his other faults, that he intended to go to the solicitor himself and have the whole matter properly examined. He believed, I think, that he was protecting the family. He did not understand that he was about to unravel the one secret that could destroy it entirely. So you killed him too." Julian's voice had gone very still, very careful, the voice of a man forcing himself through words he did not want to say. your own son, to protect a secret about your other son's death. I told myself I would find another way to stop him, Mrs. Ashworth said, and for the first time, her composure broke entirely, her voice cracking on the words. I told myself that until the very last moment, Julian, I swear it to you. But he would not be moved, and I could not have it come out. Not after everything, not after 2 years of carrying this alone, and the brandy was there, the same brandy his father used to keep, and I knew he would drink it if it was left for him, because he always did. On Christmas Eve, it was a tradition of his father's he'd kept up every year since. She could not finish. She did not need to. Inspector Hale stepped forward then, quiet and grave, and the formal words that followed, the caution, the careful, procedural language of an arrest, seemed to Eleanor, standing frozen by the window, with Cordelia's abandoned watercolours still visible on the sofa where the child had left them Christmas morning, to belong to some entirely different scene than the one that had been playing out in this warm, firelit room only moments before. It was Mrs. Florence who moved first to Julian's side, and Mrs. Florence who spoke, once Mrs. Ashworth had been led quietly from the room, her voice gentle, but without any attempt to soften what could not in truth be softened. "I am very sorry," she said simply. "There is nothing I can say that makes this easier to bear, and I shan't insult you both by pretending otherwise. But I think, in time, you will find it easier to carry the truth than you would have found it to go on carrying the not knowing. Uncertainty has a way of poisoning a house far more thoroughly than any single act, however terrible. At least now you know the shape of what you are grieving." Sylvia, white-faced but composed, reached for Julian's hand, and he let her take it, and neither of them said anything at all for a long moment, letting the fire crackle and the tinsel on the tree catch the light, the ordinary small sounds of a house continuing on, however impossibly, after everything. It was much later that evening, the house finally quiet, the children asleep, Inspector Hale long since departed with his solemn charge, that Mrs. Florence found Eleanor alone in the nursery, sitting by the banked fire with the satchel, returned to her now, its contents restored exactly as she had kept them, held loosely in her lap. "I owe you an apology, I think," Mrs. Florence said, settling herself into the chair opposite without being asked, as had become, over the course of this strange and terrible week, rather her habit. "I suspected you very seriously, for a time. It is not a comfortable thing to be looked at the way I looked at you, and I am sorry for the part of it that was unnecessary. You were only doing what needed doing." Eleanor's hand rested lightly on the satchel's worn clasp. "I understand that better than most people would, I think. I've spent a great deal of my life being looked at that way, one way or another, since the Whitmores." "Yes," Mrs. Florence said. "I rather thought you might have." She was quiet a moment, watching the fire. "You will stay on, I take it? Mrs. Ashworth's disgrace need not become yours, and those children have grown very attached to you indeed, in a very short time. I should think Julian and Sylvia will need someone steady in this house, in the months ahead, rather more than they will need to hire a stranger all over again." "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "I've grown fond of them too, fonder than I meant to let myself." "That," Mrs. Florence said, rising and gathering her coat about her, against the walk home through the cold, "is generally how the best things happen, my dear. Not by careful planning at all, but by accident, while we are busy guarding against something else entirely." She paused at the door and looked back with something that might, in the firelight, have been the ghost of a smile. "Happy Christmas, Miss Hartley. Rather belatedly, I know, but I find I mean it all the more sincerely for the delay." Outside, the snow had begun again, soft and steady, settling over Brambledene Manor and the sleeping village beyond, over a house that had held its secret for 2 long years, and had finally, at terrible cost, set it down, and over Mrs. Florence herself, walking home alone through the quiet white lanes with her dog trotting patiently at her heels, thinking, as she so often did at the end of such an evening, that people wrapped their secrets as carefully as they wrapped their Christmas gifts, and that both, in the end, however skillfully bound, always found some way of coming undone.